You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park.
Lake Tahoe is terminal. That's a technical way to explain water is not flowing out of the lake. Now, it won't always be like this, but the consequences of an extended drought go beyond the waterline.
A diver hit the bottom of Lake Tahoe in the summer of 2024 and stopped moving. Not because something was wrong, because what his lights landed on had no business being there. A vehicle, intact, paint still visible on the frame, door handle still attached, interior still recognizable, sitting on the lake floor as if someone had parked it there yesterday. His first instinct, before his brain had finished processing what he was looking at, was to swim to the driver's side window and check whether someone was still inside. That reflex, that involuntary check through the glass, is where this story begins. Because it wasn't just one car, and it wasn't just cars. And the deeper the remotely operated vehicles went after the divers hit their limits, the worse it got. The surface of Lake Tahoe still looked exactly like the postcards. That part was never a lie. But the postcard stops at the surface. What had been sitting below it, undisturbed, unseeable, suspended in the dark at depths no diver can safely reach, had been there for 70 years. And the drought of 2024 had just run out of patience with keeping it hidden. The 2024 drought was the worst the Sierra Nevada had seen in 1,200 years. Snowpack collapsed. Inflow slowed to a trickle. The lake level dropped 9 feet. And as the shoreline pulled back, it began to expose things that had been underwater for decades. Things that were never meant to be found. But the shoreline was just the warning. What remotely operated vehicles recorded at 1,600 feet down is worse. Far worse. Not a creature, not a shipwreck, not the Tahoe Tessie legend locals have whispered about since the 1800s. Something older, something quieter. And once you understand what it is, this lake, the most photographed, most visited, most celebrated alpine lake in North America, is ruined for you forever. To understand what the cameras found in the dark, you have to understand what Lake Tahoe actually is. Not the postcard version, the real version. Lake Tahoe is the second deepest lake in the United States. Only Oregon's Crater Lake goes further down. The basin was carved by geological faulting millions of years ago into something that functions less like a lake and more like a vertical shaft. The deepest point plunges 1,645 feet.
Here, 72 miles and more than 20,000 pieces of trash later, the Clean Up the Lake effort in Lake Tahoe is preparing to embark on their final mission.
The water temperature at depth never rises above 42 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected swimmer in under 20 minutes. The clarity comes from the cold. Almost nothing lives in Tahoe's deep water. The granite basin contributes almost no nutrients. The cold suppresses biological activity. Tahoe is, for practical purposes, sterile, and that sterility is exactly what draws tourists. From the surface, you can see 70 feet straight down through water that looks like liquid glass. But here is the thing nobody puts in the brochures. Drop something past 1,500 feet in Lake Tahoe, and you are not dropping it into water anymore. You are dropping it into a refrigerator the size of a city, locked from the outside with no key. The cold halts decay. The pressure pins gases in solution so they cannot bubble up and give the contents away. The dark prevents any light-driven chemistry that might break things down. The deep water in Tahoe doesn't fully circulate to the surface. It sits, still and sealed, in a way that most lakes do not. Whatever sinks below that threshold enters a kind of suspended animation. It doesn't rot. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't break down or dissolve or scatter. It waits for decades, for lifetimes, for 70 years and counting. That is what Lake Tahoe really is. Not a wilderness, not a paradise, a vault. And in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, someone figured that out and started using it accordingly. Before World War II, Lake Tahoe was hard to reach.
Yeah, because Lake Tahoe is so big, the level moves up and down a lot more slowly than lakes like Folsom and Shasta. But now Tahoe is already at its lowest level in 4 years, and it's still headed down.
The roads were treacherous, often impassable in winter. A handful of lodges served wealthy tourists. The lake was largely wild. The war changed that. Military training facilities moved into the region. Roads were improved for logistics. Soldiers stationed nearby discovered what the area looked like in summer, and when those soldiers came home with money to spend and cars to drive, they remembered. The boom hit in the late 1940s, and accelerated through the 1950s. Casinos opened on the Nevada side where gambling was legal. Resorts and hotels multiplied. Summer cabins became year-round communities. The population of the basin grew faster than anyone had planned for, faster than any regulatory structure existed to manage. And the boom generated waste, enormous quantities of it. Construction debris from hundreds of buildings going up simultaneously. Sewage from a population that hadn't existed 5 years prior. Industrial chemicals from the businesses servicing the new casinos. Metal processors, automotive shops, dry cleaners, industrial laundries handling hotel linens, photography labs, paint manufacturers. All of it generated byproducts that needed to go somewhere. In the 1950s, environmental regulations barely existed. The concept of hazardous waste disposal was in its infancy, and Lake Tahoe was right there, vast, deep, and from the surface at least, apparently bottomless. Why pay to truck waste over the Sierra Nevada when you could drive to the lake at night? The practice wasn't entirely secret. Locals knew. Construction crews disposed of debris directly into the water. Businesses dumped chemicals that would later be classified as toxic. Old equipment went in, old vehicles went in, pushed from cliffs, driven to the water's edge, and released, sometimes with their tanks still full of gasoline and oil. What made Tahoe different from the other lakes absorbing this era's indifference wasn't the dumping itself, it was the depth and the cold, and the peculiar chemistry that would preserve every single bit of it. When the environmental movement gained strength in the 1960s and 1970s, the visible dumping slowed. Regulations appeared. Monitoring began. The lake's clarity became a point of pride for conservation groups, evidence that the damage could be reversed. The surface looked clean. The water stayed clear. Whatever had gone in during the 1950s had sunk past any depth that standard monitoring could reach. Out of sight, out of mind. For 70 years, that calculation held. Then the drought came, and the drought had no interest in calculations. The 2024 drought didn't arrive without warning. Years of below-average snowpack in the Sierra Nevada had been quietly draining the lake's primary inflow. Evaporation exceeded what the streams could replenish. The waterline fell 9 feet measured against the shore. 9 feet doesn't sound like much for a lake 1,645 feet deep, but the drop happened at the margin, at the exact boundary where water meets land, and it peeled back a strip of lake bed that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The first reports were easy to dismiss. Hikers on newly exposed stretches of beach found tires, old bottles, corroded metal objects corroded past recognition. The kind of thing that accumulates near any popular lake over time. Nobody panicked. Nobody called anyone. Then the divers arrived. A nonprofit that had spent years working the lake's shallower zones, hauling debris by hand over 72 miles of the lake's perimeter, piece by piece, moved into sections that the drought had suddenly made accessible. Sections that had been underwater for generations. And what they found there had stopped being litter a long time ago. It was cars, dozens of them, concentrated near points where old access roads once ended at the water's edge. Vehicles from the 1940s, from the 1950s, from the early 1960s. Some appeared to have been driven deliberately into the water. Others had been pushed. Their distribution told a story about the specific places and the specific habits of whoever had put them there. But the cars weren't just present, they were preserved. The cold water had done what cold water does at depth. It had halted the corrosion that destroys submerged vehicles in warmer environments. Paint was still visible on some. Interior features, seats, dashboards, door panels remained recognizable. One dive team leader described swimming into a site where his lights hit a 1957 American sedan, and his first instinct, before he had processed what he was looking at, was to check whether someone was still inside. He swam to the driver's side window and looked in. A reflex, the way you look through the glass at a car wreck on the highway before your brain has finished deciding what you're seeing. That is how preserved these cars are. The door handles are still there. The dashboards are still there. The license plates on several are still legible. One of them traced back to a vehicle registration from the early 1960s. Never updated, never reported stolen. The car went into the lake, and the paperwork went into a drawer, and nobody asked questions for 60 years. But the cars were not the disturbing part. Old vehicles and lakes aren't unusual. Lakes across America collected them in this era. What stopped the dive teams? What made them stop and look again at the lake floor beneath the vehicles? Was what the cars were sitting on top of. As the survey expanded into deeper water, the operation outgrew what scuba divers could safely do. Below 200 feet, decompression risk becomes significant. Below 300 feet, recreational diving is effectively impossible. So they brought in robots. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras, articulated sample arms, powerful lights, and tethers long enough to reach the basin floor. The operators sit in a warm cabin on a research vessel, watching screens, directing the machines by joystick. The footage streams up the tether in real time. The footage from intermediate depths, 200 to 500 feet, showed more of what the divers had already documented. More cars, more debris, more evidence of the same casual, deliberate disposal that had been happening for decades. Unsettling, but consistent with what they'd expected to find. Then the ROVs went deeper. Below 1,000 feet, the cameras entered a different world. The last traces of ambient light disappeared. The temperature settled into the low 40s and stayed there. The pressure reached levels that would crush an unprotected human body. And the debris kept coming, scattered, persistent, a record of decisions made on the surface 70 years ago. At 1,400 feet, the lights illuminated something the operators initially couldn't identify. Large cylindrical shapes, sitting upright on the lake floor. Metal, industrial, dozens of them. Barrels, industrial drums, the kind used to store and transport bulk chemicals. Corroded, but structurally intact. Some still bearing visible markings. Manufacturer logos, chemical codes, handling instructions. The team leader has described watching the feed from a heated cabin on the research vessel, drinking coffee, watching the screen, and realizing he was looking at a graveyard. Row after row of corroded metal cylinders sitting in the dark exactly where someone had left them. Then the camera operator panned, and there were more barrels behind those, and more behind those, and more, fading out into the black water at the edge of the light's reach. The ROV surveyed that field for hours. The final count was not measured in dozens, it was measured in hundreds. Industrial drums do not end up at 1,400 feet by accident. They don't roll in from the shore. They don't fall off boats in those quantities. Someone transported them to the water, loaded them, deliberately, into something capable of carrying them out, and dropped them at a depth they calculated would keep them hidden forever. The distribution told the researchers something else. This wasn't a single event. The pattern was consistent with multiple dumping operations carried out over an extended period, some years apart. Some drums had clearly been full when they went in. Others had shifted before coming to rest. This was not a one-night operation. This was a system. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the kind where the bottom of a lake has been keeping a secret longer than most people alive have been alive, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. And what comes next in this particular story is worse than the barrels. The ROVs went deeper still. At 1,600 feet, near the maximum operational depth of the equipment, the barrels changed, larger, more heavily constructed, and they were not just corroded, they were open. The cameras captured what the operators initially thought was a camera malfunction, a haziness in the water column near the containers, a slow drift of particulate matter. It wasn't a malfunction. The seals had failed. The contents were seeping out. In the cold, nearly motionless water at that depth, the material didn't disperse. It hung in the column, visible plumes of whatever had been sealed inside those drums for 7 decades, slowly moving through the surrounding water. Water samples were taken as close to the leaking containers as the ROVs could safely approach. The samples were sent to a laboratory, and the results came back. The data was not ambiguous. Lead. At concentrations hundreds of times above levels considered safe for human exposure. Mercury, cadmium, arsenic, industrial solvents banned from production for decades. Chemical compounds that current federal regulations classify as hazardous waste, requiring specialized, licensed disposal. These were not trace amounts. These were not the background levels that accumulate in any body of water near human activity. These were the concentrated byproducts of mid-20th century industry, metal processing, automotive services, dry cleaning operations, industrial laundries serving the casino hotels, photography processing labs, paint and coating manufacturers. Every business that generated chemical waste and needed it to disappear cheaply and without documentation. The lake was deep enough, they had calculated, that no one would ever know. Researchers pieced together a timeline from the chemical signatures. The heaviest dumping appears to have occurred between 1948 and 1965. This corresponds precisely to the casino development boom on the Nevada side. The construction surge, the years when the region was growing faster than any regulatory framework could track. In that era, disposing of hazardous waste properly was expensive. In many cases, it wasn't legally required, so it went into the lake. For decades, the logic of that decision held. Water quality monitoring focused on the surface. The deep lake was assumed pristine because nobody could check. The surface stayed clear. The brochures kept printing. The tourists kept coming. But containment is not permanent. Metal corrodes, even in cold water. Seals fail. Contents migrate. And the monitoring data revealed something that reframes everything. Trace concentrations of heavy metals were appearing at depths far shallower than the drums could explain through direct seepage. The contamination has been spreading, slowly, quietly, for years, migrating upward through the water column, toward the layers where people swim, where people fish, where drinking water is drawn. Lead does not break down. Mercury does not break down. Arsenic does not break down. Whatever escaped those drums is no longer sitting at 1,600 feet. It is moving. A family drives to the South Shore for a week in July. The kids jump off the dock. Someone fills a water bottle from the tap. Someone else grills the trout caught that morning. Every one of those interactions sits downstream of a barrel that went into that lake before any of them were born. The pristine waters of Lake Tahoe are not pristine. They haven't been for decades. The monitoring just couldn't reach deep enough to know. But the barrels are not the only thing the ROVs found. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Among the debris documented by the deep ROV surveys were objects that did not fit the pattern of industrial dumping. Personal items, luggage, clothing remnants, preserved by the cold in the same way the barrels were preserved. And in several locations along the deepest sections of the basin, what the operators on the research vessel described as forms that should not be there. Lake Tahoe has a history the tourism boards do not advertise. During the casino era, organized crime had a documented and significant presence in the Tahoe-Reno corridor. The region was contested territory between competing organizations. Disputes were sometimes resolved violently. And when someone needed to disappear, Tahoe was nearby, it was deep, and it was cold enough, locals had long understood, to prevent the decomposition that typically brings remains to the surface. For decades, this was treated as local legend, colorful, atmospheric, the kind of story told at bars near the Nevada casinos by people with long memories. Fact-checkers correctly identified it as unverified. No documented recovery of mob-related remains in the lake had ever been publicly confirmed. Historians who study organized crime in Nevada are careful to note that the legend outran any evidence. What the ROV footage changed was not the legend, it changed the conditions. Because the footage confirmed, beyond dispute, that the cold at depth does exactly what the legend always claimed. Objects at 1,400 feet are not degraded, they are preserved. The vehicles, the barrels, the clothing visible near the debris fields, items that by any normal law of chemistry should have dissolved over 7 decades, are instead sitting intact, unchanged, waiting. Specific portions of the deepwater footage have not been released to the public. The environmental data went public. The barrels, the contamination levels, the migration patterns. That data was shared
openly with monitoring agencies and the press. But certain frames from the deepest sections of the survey were withheld, pending review by federal investigators and the Washoe County Sheriff's Office. The County Sheriff's Office issued a brief statement confirming only that the footage was under active review and that the matter was open. What members of the dive and ROV teams have described, in conversations with regional journalists on background, is this. The surveys encountered what appear to be human remains in multiple locations along the basin floor. The cold has preserved them in ways that standard decomposition science would not predict for remains this old. They are not skeletons. The soft tissue has been maintained by the near-freezing temperature, the absence of oxygen, the lack of organisms that would ordinarily consume organic matter. One operator, speaking to a reporter on condition of anonymity, said only this: "I have a hard time sleeping after that shift." These are not archaeological remains, not bones and sediment. These are people, in their clothing, in the postures they were in when they entered the water, held in suspension by the same chemistry that preserved the drums and the cars and the license plates. Associated debris near the remains, clothing styles, personal effects, vehicle models nearby, suggests most date to the period between the 1950s and the 1970s, the peak years of mob activity in the Tahoe region. The same cold that preserved the barrels preserved the people. The same dark that hid the chemicals hid the victims. Cases that went cold 50 and 60 years ago because nobody could locate the evidence was there the entire time, sitting at 1,600 feet, waiting for a drought and a robot with a camera. The question that researchers, officials, and residents are now sitting with is the one nobody has a clean answer to. What do you do about it? The environmental contamination is the most immediate problem. Heavy metals leaching toward the water supply of a lake that feeds downstream communities, that supports a commercial fishing industry, that draws millions of recreational users every year. This is not an abstract concern. It is a public health situation unfolding in slow motion, and the timeline is not measured in centuries anymore. But remediation at this scale has no precedent. The barrels sit at depths that are expensive and dangerous to work at. Disturbing corroded containers at 1,600 feet risks accelerating the very release that partial containment has so far slowed. Pull a drum off the bottom, and you may trigger the chemical event you were trying to prevent. Leave it down there, and the corrosion continues. The seals continue to fail. The contamination continues to move. There is no clean answer. There is only the choice of which problem to accept. Some researchers argue for leaving the drums in place and intensifying monitoring, building a picture of the migration rate, establishing whether intervention is necessary before the contamination reaches critical concentrations at accessible depths. Others argue that leaving documented toxic waste in one of America's most iconic bodies of water is simply unacceptable, regardless of the remediation risk. That corrosion will continue. That the question is not whether the seals fail, but when. That the longer the decision is deferred, the worse the eventual release becomes. State and federal working groups have been formed, studies commissioned, funding requested. The bureaucratic response is real. It is also slow. And the barrels are not waiting for the working groups to finish their reports. The human remains present a different kind of impossibility. Recovery operations at those depths would be extraordinarily expensive and logistically complex. The cases they would reopen involve suspects who are almost certainly dead, organizations that no longer exist in recognizable form, witnesses who have been gone for decades. The evidentiary value of a recovery is genuine. The prosecutorial path leads nowhere practical. For the families of people who disappeared in the Tahoe region in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s and were never found, people whose families have been carrying an open question for most of their lives, that calculation is not abstract. Some of those families have been waiting across generations for a simple answer to a simple question. Where did they go? The answer, it appears, was always
The same place. The lake kept it for them. It just took 7 decades and a drought to say so. There is also the question of accountability. The industrial dumping was not done by anonymous individuals acting alone. It was done by companies, often with the implicit, sometimes explicit, acceptance of local officials. Records suggest permits were issued that should not have been. Inspections were not conducted. Complaints were not followed up. The system that was supposed to protect Lake Tahoe instead accommodated the people
who were using it as a waste facility. Most of those individuals are long dead. Most of those companies no longer exist. But the institutional patterns that made this possible are not historical artifacts. They are not unique to Lake Tahoe. They are not even unique to this era. What we found at the bottom of one lake is, almost certainly, a preview of what we would find if we looked closely at any of them. The drought will end. It always does. Water levels will recover. The shoreline debris that became visible in 2024 will slip back beneath the surface. The beaches will be swimming beaches again. The lake will look exactly as it always has. Clear, blue, spectacular in the Sierra Nevada light. The brochures will keep describing it as one of the last pristine places in America, because the economy of the region depends on that image. And the image is accurate in the only way the brochures have ever cared about. The surface is genuinely beautiful. The water above a certain depth genuinely is that clear. The picture just stops at the surface. It always has. What the picture leaves out, what nobody photographed for 70 long years, is the only part that matters now. The knowledge exists. The water samples exist. The footage exists. The ROV logs from those deep survey hours cannot be unfound. The contamination data cannot be unpublished. Whatever the Washoe County Sheriff's Office is reviewing in those withheld frames cannot be unseen by the people who watched the feed from that heated cabin on the research boat and had trouble sleeping afterward. For 70 years, depth was protection. Darkness was concealment. The simple impossibility of seeing the bottom was the guarantee that the bottom would never be seen. Technology changed that calculation. The drought accelerated the reckoning. What was found will not be unfound. And so the lake sits, as beautiful as it has ever been, as perfectly photographed as it has ever been, with millions of visitors a year still coming to stand at the shore and feel the particular quiet of a place that seems too vast to carry secrets. Beneath that surface, at 1,600 feet, in water that has not moved significantly in decades, what was put there is still there, leaking slowly into the column, moving toward the light, as preserved as the day it went in. The postcard is real. The picture is real. The lake really is that beautiful. But the picture stops at the surface, and what it leaves out has been waiting a very long time to be seen. So here is where this leaves you. The environmental agencies have their working groups. The sheriff's office has its active review. The researchers have their monitoring data. The lawyers will eventually have their jurisdiction questions and their remediation liability frameworks and their interagency coordination timelines. And at 1,600 feet, the drums keep leaking at whatever pace corroded metal in cold water leaks. There are really only two ways to think about what comes next. Either the right move is to disturb the lake bottom, to mount the recovery operations, bring up the barrels, document what the cameras found in those withheld frames, accepting the risk that the disturbance accelerates the chemical release and turns a slow leak into an event, knowing that the criminal cases it reopens lead nowhere, doing it anyway, because leaving known toxic waste and unrecovered human remains in a lake that millions of people swim in and drink from is not, in the end, a defensible position. Or the right move is to leave it alone, monitor, contain where possible, accept that the lake has become the permanent resting place of things that cannot safely be moved, and that the families who have been waiting 60 years for answers will keep waiting. If this story changed how you see the places we call pristine, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if what's at the bottom of Lake Tahoe is the kind of thing you can't
Stop thinking about. Wait until you see what investigators found inside a drained reservoir in the Nevada desert last spring. That one makes this look like the beginning of a much longer list.